Okay, so are you ready for this? Today we're diving into some seriously fascinating but complex stuff. Iran's nuclear program. You sent over a bunch of Wikipedia articles on this, and wow, it's a wild ride through history and politics and some really high stakes stuff.
Yeah, you're telling me. To really get where Iran stands today, we need to rewind. It's not just about uranium and centrifuges, right? It's about the whole picture, like the whole global chessboard.
Okay, I'm all about the bigger picture, so where do we even start with something like this?
Well, every good story needs a referee, and in the world of nuclear energy, that's Inamish,
Right,
the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They're like the nuclear watchdogs, right?
Right.
Making sure no one's breaking the rules. But they weren't always around, were they?
Exactly. Picture 1957. Cold War is in full swing. The atom's been split, and everyone both excited and terrified by this new power. The IAEA came out of that tension, this desire to use nuclear energy for good, but also prevent like a total catastrophe.
So how does an organization like that even work? Do they have like a secret nuclear police force or something?
Not quite. Think of them more like nuclear accountants and safety inspectors all rolled into one. They set the global safety standards for nuclear facilities. They give support especially to developing countries. And probably most importantly, they do inspections to make sure no one's secretly building bombs.
Okay, so if a country wants to build a reactor, the IAEA is there to make sure it's not a cover for something more dangerous. Got it. But how does Iran fit into all of this?
Well, Iran's nuclear journey actually starts back in the 1960s. And here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. actually played a big part in the early stages.
Wait, seriously, the U.S. helped Iran with its nuclear program. That's not what I expected, given how things are now.
It's true. Back then, the political landscape was totally different. Iran, under the Shah, was a U.S. ally, a buffer against the Soviet Union in the region. The U.S. even helped build the Tehran research reactor, which is still running today. It was a time of cooperation, shared goals. Of course, we know that changed drastically.
Yeah, you have the U.S. helping Iran develop nuclear tech. Then fast forward to today and its sanctions and standoffs. What happened? Was there one event that changed everything?
You could say that. 1979 was a turning point, the Iranian Revolution. The Shah was overthrown. Ayatollah Khomeini takes power. And Iran's relationship with the West, especially the U.S., completely falls apart.
And this obviously had a big impact on Iran's nuclear ambitions, right?
Absolutely. It's during the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s that you see Iran's desire for nuclear tech really solidify. They started working on facilities like the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which actually has a crazy backstory.
Okay, I'm always up for a good story. Tell me more.
Well, picture this. Construction on Bushehr starts in the 70s by a German company. But then the revolution happens and everything stops. Then during the Iran-Iraq War, it gets bombed multiple times
Yeah.
by the Iraqi Air Force,
Whoa, talk about a rough start. This power plant has seen some things.
to say the least. It was stuck in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war. Finally, after years of delays, Russia steps in to help finish it, and it finally goes online in 2011.
So we've got this complicated history already, but something tells me it's about to get even more complicated. What's next in this nuclear saga?
That's where we get to the really tough questions. The early 2000s, when the world really started to question what Iran was really up to. And that is a story for part two. So remember how the IAEA does all those inspections? Well, as we get into the 21st century, things start to heat up. In 2003, they made a pretty big discovery. Iran had been conducting secret nuclear activities, stuff they weren't supposed to be doing.
Uh-oh. What were they hiding?
Turns out Iran had been enriching uranium, but to a level way higher than you need for just power plants. And that set off alarm bells everywhere because highly enriched uranium, that can be used to make weapons.
Right.
So now you have Iran with this history of secrecy, and they're sitting on a potential stockpile of bomb-making material.
Okay, so everyone's freaking out. What happens next? Did the IAEA shut them down?
Not exactly. The IAEA, they can investigate, they can report what they find, but they can't just stop a country from developing nuclear tech. That's where the UN Security Council comes in, specifically the P51.
Hold on, P51, remind me who that is again?
Right. It's the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So US, UK, France, Russia, China, plus Germany. They're the big players in all this.
Okay.
So the P51, they hit Iran with sanctions, demanding that they stop all uranium enrichment.
And what did Iran say to all of this?
Oh, they definitely had something to say. All along, Iran insisted that their nuclear program was completely peaceful for energy medical research, things to help their people. They said they had every right to this technology under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which they signed back in '68.
Okay, so Iran's saying, we're not building bombs, we just want nuclear power. But there's still this cloud of suspicion hanging over them. Besides the enrichment levels, was there anything else making people distrust Iran?
There was one issue that really raised eyebrows: the Parjan military complex.
What about it?
The IAEA suspected that Iran had been doing experiments there, experiments related to building nuclear weapons.
Oh,
So they asked to inspect the site, but Iran refused
multiple times.
multiple times, which honestly doesn't look great, right? If you're not doing anything wrong, why not just let them see?
Yeah, it gives the impression they're hiding something.
Exactly. They did eventually let the IAEA do a limited inspection of Parchin in 2015, but that was years later. And by then, the site had been changed so much that it was hard to tell what had really gone on there.
Wow, so you have this standoff, secret enrichment, a suspicious military site, sanctions, distrust. What happens next?
Well, that's where we enter a whole new chapter, one filled with diplomacy negotiations and unfortunately some proxy conflicts. The world tries to walk this tightrope between stopping a nuclear Iran and navigating these super delicate geopolitical relationships.
All right, so we've got all this tension building, but also this desire to find a peaceful solution. How does that play out?
Well, it leads to some pretty major diplomatic efforts. The negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action,
Yeah.
the JCPOA.
The JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, as it was called. This was huge back in 2015. It felt like a big breakthrough. Remind me, what was the JCPOA supposed to do?
The goal was ambitious. To put it simply, they wanted to limit Iran's nuclear program in a way that everyone could verify, and in exchange, sanctions on Iran would be lifted. So the deal placed limits on how much uranium Iran could enrich, how much enriched uranium they could keep, even the types of centrifuges they were allowed to use. Plus, the IAEA got more access to inspect Iranian nuclear sites.
So there were checks and balances in place. At least on paper, it seemed like a good plan. What happened? Why didn't it work?
Well, you said it on paper. The JCPOA was controversial right from the start. Hardliners on both sides, in Iran and in the West, especially the U.S., they said it gave too much away. They said it didn't address other issues like Iran's missiles or their support for groups like Hezbollah.
And then there was the whole Trump thing, right?
Exactly. In 2018, President Trump pulls the U.S. out of the JCPOA,
Yeah.
saying it was the worst deal ever. And he put sanctions back on Iran. It was a huge blow to the agreement, and Iran felt betrayed, so they started to back away from their commitments.
Wow, it sounds like one step forward, two steps back.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And to make things even more complicated, while all this is going on, you have these proxy conflicts popping up around the region. It was like Iran and the U.S. were fighting a shadow war, backing different sides in places like Syria and Yemen.
So you have the nuclear deal on one hand, and then things are heating up in other areas at the same time.
Exactly. These proxy conflicts just made everything worse. More distrust, harder to fix the JCPOA. It all came to a head in 2020 when a U.S. drone strike killed Qasem Soleimani, a top Iranian general in Iraq.
That was a major escalation.
It was.
And then Iran retaliated, firing missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq.
Yes. Tensions were incredibly high. And in the middle of all this, there was that awful incident with the Ukrainian passenger plane. Shot down by Iranian forces. Everyone on board was killed. Iran said it was a mistake.
Yeah.
That they mistook it for a threat because everyone was on such high alert.
So here we are today. The nuclear deal is in tatters. There are still proxy conflicts, simmering distrust everywhere. Where do things stand right now with Iran's nuclear program? You mentioned they're still enriching uranium, even going beyond what the JCPOA allowed.
That's right. After the U.S. pulled out, Iran gradually started ramping things up again. They're enriching more uranium to higher levels. They're using more advanced centrifuges. All of it violates the JCPOA.
So they're really pushing the boundaries. What's the world doing about it?
It's a mixed bag. A lot of condemnation and then scrambling to figure out what to do. The IAEA is still trying to monitor Iran's program, but they're facing roadblocks.
Yeah.
Limited access delays, that sort of thing.
It sounds like a very delicate situation. So what now? Can they salvage some kind of agreement, or are we stuck?
That is the million-dollar question. There have been attempts to revive the JCPOA. The Biden administration has said they're open to rejoining. But it's tricky. Iran wants all the sanctions lifted first, and the U.S. doesn't want to do that without some guarantees from Iran about their nuclear program.
So another standoff. Are there any other options? What about more sanctions?
Sanctions are always a possibility, but they're a blunt instrument. Iran has been under sanctions for decades. It hurts their economy. It hurts ordinary people. But it doesn't always change the minds of those in charge.
And of course, there's the military option, which nobody wants.
Rightfully so. Using force against Iran's nuclear facilities would be disastrous. It could easily spiral into a regional war.
So we're left with this incredibly complex and unstable situation. Diplomacy is stalled, sanctions haven't worked, military action is unthinkable. It's hard to be optimistic.
I understand that.
Mm.
But there are glimmers of hope. Remember we talked about those proxy conflicts?
Yeah.
Well, recently, Iran helped broker a peace agreement
Yeah.
between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebels in Yemen.
Really?
It led to a ceasefire and a decrease in violence, a major breakthrough after years of war.
Wow, that's huge. So Iran's playing peacemaker now.
It's complicated. We don't know exactly what's going on in their leadership, but some experts think they're trying to position themselves as a stabilizing force in the region, hoping to gain some leverage in the nuclear talks.
So it's all connected.
It is.
Regional diplomacy, nuclear ambitions, global power dynamics, it's a lot.
It is.
But you promised a final thought, something to leave us thinking about.
Here it is. For decades, Iran has called for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East.
Right.
But given everything we've just discussed, Iran's nuclear program, the tensions, the lack of trust, how realistic is that vision?
It's a good question. Can a nation be both a source of tension and a force for peace at the same time?
Exactly.
It really highlights how complex international relations are, the balance of trust and self-interest,
And it shows how important it is to understand the history.
the motivations, the fears, and the hopes of everyone involved.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been a lot to process. But it's so important to understand these issues, especially with so much at stake. Thank you for taking us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure. As always, it's through these conversations that we can learn to navigate our increasingly complex world.